Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Today on Another View, we begin the discussion on the final topic of our Race Let's Talk About It initiative. We're calling it Race, Religion, Relationships, and Hopes for Redemption. Think about the last time you were in church, synagogue, mosque, or other place of worship. Did everyone in the room look like you? Is 11 a.m. Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America? We've got a panel of experts here ready to talk about it, and we want to hear from you too. Race and religion. We'll talk about it next on Another View, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Another View, along with the Virginia Wesleyan College's Center for Religious Studies and the Fort Monroe Authority, have partnered together to provide a safe space to talk about race and racial issues. The initiative is called Race Let's Talk About It, and today we begin our final topic in the four-part series. We start the conversations here on Another View and then take it into the community in a town hall setting. We've talked about the Confederate flag coming down in South Carolina, privilege, power, indifference, the controversial subject of white privilege, race and politics, and today our topic is race, religion, relationships, and the hope for redemption. The issue of race and religion in America. Please welcome to Another View Dr. Eric Mazur, Professor of Religious Studies at Virginia Wesleyan College. Eric, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you for being here. Dr. Melvin Marriner, who is Senior Pastor of Grove Church in Portsmouth. Melvin, how are you?
Fine, Barbara. Good to see you.
Good. Good to see you also. And Father James Curran, Pastor of the Basilica of Saint Mary of the Immaculate Conception Church in Norfolk. Father Jim, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me, both.
Good. Thank you so much for being here. We're also going to hear from Imam Vernon Fareed of Masjid William Salaam. The Imam could not join us live because we are on the air during midday prayer time. So we wanted to be respectful, obviously, of that. So, gentlemen, let me start out by asking you all a question, and I want an answer from each of you. So metaphorically speaking, is 11 a.m. the most segregated hour in America still, and why? Let me start with you, Father Jim.
I think it absolutely is. And I think it's because when it comes to worship, when it comes to that relationship that we have with the Lord, to be among people who are like you, who have the same experience, who come from that same lived experience, it is important because we do come as a people. It's not me coming to worship my God. It is me joining a group of people to worship. Mm-hmm. And when you join a people whose entire experience is different, then that impacts the way you worship, and it impacts the level to which you can really engage in the worship.
Okay. Melvin Marriner.
I definitely agree. 11 o'clock hour is the most segregated hour in America. I agree. It's the cultural conditioning. I think that many of us have been conditioned to enjoy or to perhaps prefer a certain type of or style of worship or different genres of music, able to identify with others who are sitting on the same pew with me, perhaps having similar needs that are quite different than others might be, addressing them differently. In America, we have such a diversity of needs, and those needs can be perhaps more directed or more specifically directed toward when you deal with Sunday morning worship. So I feel that it's segregated. I don't think it is as racist as people might say anymore, but I think that it is culturally conditioning.
Okay. And Eric, just to explain to our audience, not only are you a professor of religious studies, but you're also of the Jewish faith. So therefore, I'm kind of doing double duty with you here.
Sure. Two for the price of one.
Yes,
absolutely.
from that perspective. So what your response?
I guess I have a couple. One is that by definition, Sunday at 11 would be the most segregated hour because there are no Jews, there are no Muslims, there are no Hindus or Buddhists there at all. But I also think that one thing that we're I think, starting to get a handle on in the study of religion is that looking at institutional affiliation is not the best way to measure religion, because the fastest growing religion in America is the people who don't identify with a particular religion. And so not only is it segregated in terms of non-Christians, but it's segregated increasingly in terms of people who might identify themselves as spiritual but not religious, or have some sort of discomfort with some particular aspect of their faith community, or are shopping for different ones, or are expressing themselves in other ways, whether it's exercise or politics or something like that. But I also wonder about the noon hour, Monday through Friday, being segregated, particularly at our public schools, where students increasingly, I think, self-segregate. Maybe not increasingly, but still self-segregate. And also our schools are, even though we have removed segregation from the law.
When you say self-segregate at school, you mean in terms of at the lunch counter?
Yeah,
Okay,
the kids are sitting in separate groups. Maybe not everywhere, but certainly in a lot of places, and there are a number of studies about this in larger cities. But also because neighborhood schools are based on neighborhoods, and because we don't have as integrated neighborhoods as we would like, or as some would hope, the schools themselves at lunch are still very segregated.
Some people have been talking about this whole idea of how if we all believe in one God, okay, if that is the case, then why shouldn't we all come together and worship together, regardless of what your skin color is or what your need is? Is it important, or maybe is it just more important, as you all have said, for people to go in their comfort zone, especially around their faith?
I think that, if we all to say we have a centralized God, it still does not negate the fact that we have different expressions, and our expressions come out again of the things that we've been exposed to. I'm able to relate to someone else who's able to identify both with my needs as well as my advancement. Someone who can identify with the culture in which I was raised in. It doesn't mean that we can't somehow cross the line and become sitting together with whites and Hispanics and Jews at the lunch counter. But again, I think it means that who am I comfortable with? Who can I trust? Who am I around the most? And I think you do see that it is changing in this generation versus the times that I was in high school in the 70s, where you didn't see blacks and whites really together a lot. It was really very difficult in Chesapeake in the 70s.
I want to say, Father Curran, you have a unique experience because you are a white priest who is pastoring in a predominantly African-American church. And I wonder, can you talk to us a little bit about that experience? Because if we're talking about people and their comfort levels and their needs, there could seem to be a disconnect there.
I think, and we were talking a little bit earlier, it's very different if it's a black minister in a white church than a white minister in a black church, because and one of my parishioners asked me, Father, what is it like to be the only white face in a group of people? And I said, it's very different for me than it would be for you if you were in a group with white people, because the white people just are not by nature open and welcoming. The black community is, by its very nature, they look for people on the outside, and they open up and make room for them. And so they have opened up and made room for me and have done everything they can to help me not feel like a white face in a black room, because they're much more sensitive to that.
Eric, from a scholarly perspective, what is that about?
Well, I think it has to do with community experience and shared memories of experience. The question of whether we all worship one God can only be answered, I think, adequately by two groups. One is God.
Yes.
And I suppose we'll find out.
Yeah.
Maybe some others won't. I don't know. But I think there are plenty of people who would say that we don't all worship one God. They don't mean that in a negative way. I understand, the various theological arguments for or against, but certainly we all worship a different expression of God, a different face of God. If it's all the same God, I don't know. But there's a wonderful book by Stephen Prothero called God Is Not One, where he looks at the major world traditions and argues that that we do extraordinary violence to religious traditions and their uniqueness and their differences when we say, well, ultimately they're all the same, or ultimately they all get to the same point. I'm supportive of that argument. I think the key to pluralism in America is not everybody agreeing, but everybody agreeing to let the other person be wrong in their eyes. Right? So, I'm sorry.
No, you're just fine. I want to bring in Imam Vernon Fareed. As I said earlier, this is prayer hour for the Muslim community, but we did have an opportunity to interview him earlier. And let's start out by having him explain exactly what is the Muslim faith.
If you were to look at the word in Arabic language, its root means one who surrenders peacefully, which means that God created us to give in to his will. The best example of that would be looking at a baby. When a baby is born, the baby cries, or if the diaper is wet, it cries. That's the language of the baby, because the baby has not yet learned to talk. So that nature that is being displayed by the child is really Muslim nature. The fact that we sleep at night, when usually most people, when the sun goes down, it's natural for the body to kind of give in to that. So any act that is a natural act of submission to the way that we are created, that's really what Muslim means. But now it is understood or perceived especially in contemporary society, to be associated with religion, but it's really a nature.
So he's saying that it's really more of a nature and a way of living. But wouldn't each of your religions that you represent say that it is about a way of living?
Yeah, most definitely. It's not so much about the do's and don'ts or the rituals, and they're important, but it's more about relationship, whether one is spiritual or religious. I think there's both. If you do it more than one time, it becomes a religious exercise. But I am more spiritual in the sense that I connect not with just the do's and don'ts, but I connect with the object of my affection. And my affection as a Christian, of course, is Christ. But again, it is being inclusive. So again, I definitely agree that there are so many expressions of who God is, and our love for him.
And I know that because of what's been happening between 9/11 and some other, I guess, ways that people have used religion in a way that has been destructive, that becomes problematic. And I think there's a section where Vernon talks about, or Imam Fareed talks about, the segregation of Muslims in our society. Why so segregated, Victor?
So I think that a lot of people believe that they have a quote-unquote monopoly on truth, and that if you don't go my way, then the only other alternative is hell, or the hellfire. So you have to embrace my religion. And if you don't embrace my religion, you're going the wrong way. So I believe that in part that accounts for the division that people think that, well, I think that most people believe at least that they have the right religion. My personal belief is that, and I found this from my study, that there's truth in all religions. And I, even right now, as a Muslim, I draw from the truth that I can find in Christianity, the best as I understand truth. I draw from the truth of Judaism. I draw from the truth of even Hinduism and Buddhism. And that's what I accept. I accept truth, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of whatever label it might come under. If it's truth, it's truth. And I don't reject character or morals or values that I deem to be worthy of me embracing. So for me, that's religion. And so religion for the Muslim, religion is a way of life. It's not to be perceived or understood in the contemporary sense that most people label religion, just going to my place of worship and going through some rituals and praying. And it's more than that. It's the whole life, how I live my whole life, what I eat, how I interact with people, how I treat my wife and my children, what I do on my job, what I will do and will not do based on my moral values. It's my whole life.
Eric Mazur, why are people so afraid of Muslims and of that particular faith?
Wow, that goes back a long time. I think, in the United States, there's been sort of a myth of Muslim fear only going back to maybe 9/11, or maybe people would say the hostage crisis and the Carter presidency. But there's been almost 2,000-year animosity, or maybe that's a little harsh, but certainly difficult relations between Christianity and Islam, based on a variety of things, some of which are theological, I suppose, but many of which are what we in the United States would call political. The rest of the world doesn't distinguish between politics and religion. They're entirely the same thing and make perfect sense only in unity. But when you have an empire of Christianity confronting an empire of Islam, you have conflict. And that, in many ways, is to be distinguished between some of the difficult relationships between Christians and Jews, because Jews were never the political threat that Muslims were, and so they could easily be marginalized and things like that. On the other hand, Christians and Jews within the Muslim world were also not a threat politically. They were given actually higher status in the Muslim world than Muslims and Jews were given in the Christian world, because they were seen as lesser developed theologically, but still on their way. So there's, a lot of it is fear about the other. A lot of it is fear that maybe they're right and you're wrong, which is difficult for people to deal with. A lot of it is based on the sense that whatever you're doing because absolutely everything is at stake, right? Not just your well-being, but the fate of the cosmos. And so any threat to that is really jeopardizing the entire project.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. We're talking about race and religion and how it affects our coming together in this country. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Dr. Marriner, I saw you shaking your head in agreement.
No, I was definitely agreeing that the again, quote unquote, word conflict between Nation of Islam or Islamic faith and Christianity goes back so far. One of the things that I'm looking at now, I see a change in how we approach each other. Dogmatism hopefully is being decreased, that we can kind of honestly embrace people and really understand that just because I am separated doesn't mean that I don't identify with who you are or I don't respect who you are. And so sometimes we look at separation as a negative. And sometimes if we use it correctly and know when to bridge over, because again, you won't find many black leaders or pastors over white congregations. You won't find that. Is that racist or conditioning? And so,
which is it? What do you think?
I'm not that smart to really define what it is. I can't speak for everyone. I see that, as Father said earlier, I think that more whites are a little apprehensive. Blacks are more inclusive. We can get along with most people, and we want to get along. We want to accept you and want to be part of the system. And I've had people to leave our congregation say we want to go to a church that looks more like the kingdom of God. Some of them have come back, but again, I have to allow that. That's not something that I can control. I have to respect that. That's their desire. And so I think that it's about the melting pot. We're able to cross the bridge when necessary, to respect each other and not hold each other in such a negative and perhaps marginalizing them because they're Jews or because they're Catholic or because they're Baptist or Methodist. Within the Protestant faith, there's a whole lot of issues as well. So,
well, one of the things that you and Father Curran brought up before we started the show, the idea of certain Protestant groups assign pastors, like in the Catholic Church and in the United Methodist Church, as an example. Other churches, like the Baptist Church, I believe, hire their pastor. So I'm wondering if the structure, and Eric, you can answer this also from your studies, but if the structure also plays into who's assigned where and how it will continue to be perpetuated if there, that most of the time there will be a black pastor over a white church in a certain group or vice versa. Start with you, Father Curran.
Well, what we have learned is that a black pastor isn't necessarily going to be the best pastor for a black parish. And I interviewed...
Interesting.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because they're not... Just because they have a black face doesn't mean that they're going to be right for that particular community, because there's more to a community than just the color of the face. And there's a rich heritage that a black priest may not associate with. So a black parish can be very conservative, or a black parish can be a very progressive. And a black priest, just because he's black, if he's a very liberal priest in a very conservative parish, is not going to work. So there's more that goes into it. And I interviewed with a lot of members, about 40 members of the church, before I was officially assigned. Mm-hmm. And they were given the right to say yes or no.
Wow.
And I thank God every day that they said yes, because there is nothing in the world.
Yeah, I heard you guys got a killer gospel choir too over there.
But it's not just the choir, and I say this all the time. The people come, and it goes back to what draws the people there, and it's a hunger. They come with the worship. They bring the worship into this church, and then I'm just honored to be a part of that. When that goes on, the choir is spectacular, but it's more than that. The people who are there are.
I'm gonna give you bragging rights too, Melvin.
No, I'm thinking, and I'm glad he clarified the fact that he said a black pastor may not be. I mean, and again, not the color. Again, I think is the context in which the preacher or the pastor perhaps expresses his love or in relationship to each other with other people. As I mentioned earlier, we've had some people leave our congregation to go, we want to look at the kingdom of God. And I don't know if they know what that really looks like or not. But again...
What do they think it looks like? When somebody comes to you and says that, what's your... or what are they telling you? What do you think?
They're telling me that we want to make sure that we have an experience that is not so much unique just to the black culture. We want to go here and experience and praise God and be together as one. And I'm saying that just because we hold hands doesn't mean we're one. Just because we're in the same center of worship or whatever doesn't mean that we have this type of oneness. Oneness is something that you have to respect me for me and accept me for me while I'm improving. It doesn't mean you have to like everything about me, but you have to at least allow all of me to come to the table. And so we find out that isn't always happening. We still deal with the, I think, residue of slavery. Most white folk don't want to deal with that issue, but we still deal with the residue of slavery, where black people feel comfortable having a white leader, whereas white congregations don't feel as comfortable having a black leader. I'm not saying that they're racist. I'm saying that there are still systemic issues that came out of a period where people were marginalized and dehumanized just because of the context in which they lived and the content of what they believed.
Eric, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of great commentary in both these speakers. I'm trained in part as a historian of religion in America, and so I always try and put things in historical context. I think a lot of the issue with race in leadership positions in American Catholicism has to do with how small the African American Catholic community was for a very long time. And so the development, at least in the United States, the development of leadership from among the African American community in the Catholic Church was very late in developing. With American Protestants, we find historically that Protestant movements like Pentecostalism, which doesn't, at least in its early years, require seminary training, is much more religiously diverse. Denominations like the Episcopal Church, which require seminary training, are going to limit people economically and in terms of their background and education. They have to be prepared for seminary to go to seminary. And, economics and education are two very continuingly racist factors in America. And so you have fewer African Americans going into leadership positions there as well.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. And if you're just joining us, we're talking about race and religion as part of our Race Let's Talk About It initiative with Dr. Eric Mazur with Virginia Wesleyan College, Dr. Melvin Marriner, senior pastor of Grove Church, and Father James Curran of the Basilica of Saint Mary of the Immaculate Conception Church. Let's go to David in Virginia Beach. Hi, David. You're on the air.
Shalom. I gotta say something to Vernon and Fareed. My name's David Israel. I'm the co-host of Torah Nights Radio, and which you can look on YouTube and listen to me at 9:00 every Tuesday. But Vernon and Fareed, I was born a Hebrew, right? A Messianic Hebrew. And I converted to Islam at one time when I was 15 years old. And I stayed in that until about the age of like 20. And I researched a lot of things about that religion. And I did not find everybody want to blame Christianity for being racist. Now, I agree with that. But what I found is that the Arab Muslims had more so-called black slaves than anybody else, and out of every other religion that I've studied. So I eventually went back to my Hebraic culture.
Okay, David, let me let Dr. Mazur speak to your point. Now, Dr. Fareed, Imam Fareed is not with us because it is time for holy prayers during this hour. So we have him on tape. So he won't be able to answer your question specifically, but I would like to ask Dr. Mazur to respond. Thanks for your call. We appreciate that.
Sure. I think there are very few people in the Western monotheistic world, very few cultures that don't have blood on their hands in terms of slavery. There's slavery described in the Hebrew Scriptures. There's slavery described in the New Testament. There's slavery in Islam. There's slavery. A lot of that had to do with political conquest, and we see slavery in the Roman world and other empires. I think one of the if I can call it, unique innovations of the primarily Christian North America or Western Hemisphere is chattel slavery as opposed to conquest. The Romans gave slaves rights. Mm-hmm. The slaves in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian Scriptures had rights. It's not really until we get to the slave culture in North America and the Caribbean and even to some extent in South America, that we have the total removal of humanity for slaves. So, I think we can read, yes, the Muslim world was involved in part of the slave trade. Mm-hmm. They were in Africa, they sold people into slavery, and then the Christians bought them and moved them here. Everybody has... nobody's without blame on that one.
Well, one of the things I think people struggle with sometimes also especially those who say that they may not be spiritual or that the church is disingenuous, if you will, the whole idea of using religion to control other groups or other people. I mean, obviously it happened in slavery time because you can pull from the Bible and interpret it in whatever way it works for you, I guess, in terms of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So how do you do, or what's your response to that, Father Curran?
I think it's absolutely right that people of faith have taken their religion, which is almost always a very noble thing, and made it something else. One of the things that I'd like to say, when Reverend Marriner mentioned that they may or may not be racist, I think that we have done a really good job at identifying racism as a sin, but we've done such a great job that we have created a situation where people are in denial about it. So it's more of a social disease than it is a personal sin, and it is a personal sin when I respond to that, when I give in to that, it becomes a personal sin. But the racism is there, and the racism does form our consciousness, and it is important to recognize that we are formed by that. So I would say that it is a participation in racism, whether or not that person is completely racist in their heart, I don't know, but it is a participation in that evil which is existent in our culture.
I want to play a clip real quick, and I'll come back to you, from Imam Fareed that goes along these same lines. Muslim discrimination, please.
Classic example of that is that I have myself interacted with people just the way I normally do, having conversation. If something is said that's funny to me or humorous to me, I may laugh, and we're having a conversation. And sometimes I will just test the waters and just say, I said, well, I'm Muslim. And I can see the whole atmosphere change instantly. But I was okay when you thought I was not Muslim. But now that I have made known to you that I'm Muslim, then the whole atmosphere changes. Now, that's not with everybody, of course. But I think the description that you gave of the young lady with her hijab on, her scarf on, in one instance, she does not have it on. And she's getting help from everybody, because they just see her as a typical American woman that is in need of help. But now that she has her scarf on, oh, that's a Muslim. That's one of those, quote unquote, terrorists, or one of those people who are associated with that terrorist religion, or whatever images they have in their heads and their minds about what that particular woman represented, by virtue of the fact that she now has her scarf on. So we associate her with this image that we have of what she represents.
So back to that whole idea of our own perceptions and how they affect us. I was just getting ready to go to line 2, and it just dropped. So Eric, you had wanted to respond to something else earlier.
Yeah, well, actually, it ties into something Imam Fareed just said. This notion of the typical American. We don't have to go very far back in American history to see race as an entirely different thing. I'm doing some research on a boat of refugees in 1940 that came to Norfolk, and the customs documents indicate the race of the people on board. Only a few of them are African, but their race is Russian, their race is Irish, their race is Hebrew, right? So all of these races, a lot of it has to do. One author on Mormonism who looks at Mormons and how they were treated as a separate race. His comment is that race is not necessarily about pigmentation, but about an assumption of the capacity of that group to govern the United States. That sort of goes unspoken, but to govern. Mm-hmm. And so if Muslims are perceived as being inappropriate to govern or participate in the body politic, then they are a separate race. If African Americans are perceived as inappropriate to govern, they are a separate race. At a time, Jews were inappropriate, Catholics were inappropriate, so they were a separate race. I think in many ways that's a much more useful way of understanding race because it gets to the heart of the power discussion. I think people are afraid of difference, and skin color is one way of noting difference. But so is a head covering, whether it's a kippah or a hijab or something like that. Mm-hmm. But really what it gets to the heart of is the almost religious notions of nationalism that all people walk around with, and the spontaneous evaluation of whether some group or another is appropriate to govern.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Latish joins us from Hampton. Hi, Latish, you're on the air. Could you turn your radio down, Latish, please?
440-2665 or 1-800.
Hello?
240
Latice, could you turn your radio down?
Hi, how are you?
Doing good. What's your question, please?
I'm going to ask my question and take the response off the phone, if that's okay.
That's fine.
I just want to make the comment that African Americans have been practicing Islam here in America since the 20s and even before then. Why is it that when Islam is talked about, you don't hear about the African American presence in those conversations? And I'll take my comment off the air.
Okay. So, all right. I think I understand what he's saying. Thank you very much, Latice, for your call. Do you want to answer, Eric?
I'll give it a shot.
And then I'll come to the rest of you.
Actually, records of African American practice of Islam go back to the slave period. Even before they would have been considered African American, Africans were Muslims. There's very little record of it because they were not writing in English, and if they were able to write at all. So, but we do have diaries of Africans who were Muslims. Mm-hmm. The rise in the 1920s of particularly the Nation of Islam, but also the Moorish Science Temple and other groups, brought a certain visibility to another form of Islam. Many Muslims would say it's not Islam, but that's for them to work out. And it was seen as notorious, and people like most recently Louis Farrakhan really threaten, I think, the American notion of the African American Protestant as fitting in. This really expands the notion of danger. But I think African Americans are treated differently, whether they're Muslim or not. So those who are going to be racist never have to consider whether they're Muslim or not, because they're already considering their race.
Considering the race from the beginning.
It's almost like a double whammy. Mm-hmm. But the largest Muslim countries in the world are not Arab in terms of their population. But because of the role of the Middle East in certain political issues in the United States of the last 20, 30, 40 years, and also this notion of othering of the Arab in the Western world, they've taken on Arab Muslims have taken on a particular notorious role in American politics.
Did you want to respond?
Well, in part to that, unfortunately, much of our tradition as Africans, we lost it because we had more of an oral tradition. And so many things just happened when we lost the power of transference from one generation to the next. I was going back to a previous comment about religion and race, because oftentimes both can be very manipulative. Even within the church itself, we use religion to manipulate the minds of people, basically not in essence to build them with God, but to build them to the person who's standing before them every week. And so we are engaging in some form of idolatry in our current churches, because we want people to see how anointed and how gifted we are, rather than showing them what diversity really looks like. Everyone who sits in my congregation, they have different expressions. And what's really good is that we still have some things that are common, some things that we can rally around. When we had the nation going through this crisis that we're facing now with racism and blue on black, we now are able to express that in a predominantly black church, where other churches might kind of play around with it. We don't want to upset our members. We don't want to get them disenchanted. But it's a lot goes on. Again, I guess I'm getting back to, is segregation always bad? And I must say that segregation isn't always bad unless it is a hierarchical perspective. One is better than the other. One is inferior because we over here, you're less than or you're greater than. I think that is one of the most demonic.
The problem is.
Yeah, that is one of the most satanic and demonic, horrific experiences we've had in America. Not identifying people for people.
Melvin, are we still using the black church as the town square in terms of social issues, as it was used during the civil rights movements and other times when really that was the only gathering place where blacks could come together in one place to find out what was happening on a social basis?
I still think we carry some authority, some perhaps influence. I think social media has really kind of is jockeying for second or first position. I'm not sure which one, but I think social media has such great influence, and the church has ceased to have the power of influence because, again, we have become so polarized. And so the church still has power. I think that we find more people, minorities, in church on Sunday than in any other place in given
According
week.
to the Pew Research Center, according to their numbers, that is true. Yeah, definitely. Lance joins us from Portsmouth. Hi, Lance. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. And a great discussion, and thank you for your guests. I'm from Portsmouth, Virginia, African-American male, raised Catholic, family predominantly Baptist, and some fellow members are part of the Kingdom Hall, and military. So I've traveled and been stationed almost everywhere, East and West Coast and overseas. And I think one of the biggest problems we have, and I thank you for this discussion, but I think there's a difference between racism and prejudice. I think that there's a natural prejudice of people who want to see leaders in their community, leaders at their church. They want to see a community that reflects themselves. And especially if they're isolated and not used to diversity, it feels uncomfortable for them. But it's not necessarily racism. And when we look at everything just from the racist prism, you automatically disenfranchise and cut people off from the discussion. And I thank you for listening, and we'll take my comment off the air.
Okay, thank you, Lance, for the call. Who wants to respond? I mean, in some ways, he's saying a lot of what we've been saying in terms of the comfort level, Father Curran.
I'd like to know how old he is, first of all, and also just give a call out to the millennials who are changing the whole dynamic of every conversation in our country. And I think they are going to change the way we talk about race, the way we talk about the social issues like abortion. I think it's fascinating that if you ask in a certain way, you can say that these millennials are by far the most pro-life generation. But if you ask it in a different way, they are by far the most pro-choice, because they think it's ridiculous that an issue of that complexity is going to come down to a choice of one or the other. It is far too complex, and they refuse to engage in that kind of a conversation. So they're going to change the conversation on social issues, on religion and race, and I'm really excited about the future of our country when they start to when they get of age where they're leaders.
You know, you bring them up, and one of the questions I was going to ask, and Reverend Marriner, you are the pastor of a mega church. I mean, you have like thousands of people who belong, and I noticed that, or at least it seems to me, when you look at churches like Grove Church, like Wave in Virginia Beach, and some others, these huge churches, there seems to be more of a racial diversity in the crowd. Now, I don't know whether they're just showing the picture or if that, in fact, is the case.
I think showing the picture. I think when you deal with a diverse church, I think I was reading somewhere where they say at least 20% of your congregation is of a different ethnic group or persuasion. I can't say that we have that at Grove. Either they're coming because they're married to someone who's African American, or because they're young and they don't have the same biases, prejudices that many older ones have. And so again, I see the millennial generation not dealing with absolutes. As in my generation, we dealt with this is it, nothing else, absolute. So they're making us, I think they're making us become more critical thinkers.
Okay, we've only got about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get some calls in. Alex joins us from Newport News. Hi, Alex, you're on the air.
Hi, thank you. What a wonderful discussion. I'm really enjoying this.
Thank you.
I'm an outsider because I'm an atheist. So what I see looking in at believers is a lot of similarities, actually. And despite racism and there was mention of imperialism and slavery and all these terrible things that we all know about human history, the one thing that everybody shares, no matter their beliefs, their color, their culture, is this embracing of using money. So I'm wondering, do believers ever tackle the system, the monetary-based system?
When you say using money, explain that a little bit more for us so that our panelists can answer.
Right. So I would say that the need to either make a profit or to make money just as a worker, a believer in a higher power, what religions discourage, like truly discourage that whole man-born system of the monetary-based economy.
Okay, I'll let our panel decide. Thanks, Alex, for the call. Who wants to start? Go ahead, Ray.
We have a
Father Curran.
We have a whole body of teaching on economic justice and the fundamental option for the poor. And what we teach is that the needs of the poor always overpower the desires of the wealthy. And so on a personal level, our teaching is to try and form a person's conscience that before I buy this second house, is there a more just use of my extra money, and how can I be a part of that economic justice and make this world more economically just? So we have that teaching in our tradition. Just because we have the teaching doesn't mean that we have the practice. And we are you will hear far more people talk about the issue of abortion, the issue of same-sex marriage, than you will hear talk on this. But this is an important moral teaching of the church that largely goes unspoken, and I think that's a shame.
We hear people talk about 10%. You're supposed to tithe your 10% and so forth, and people giving up their last dollar,
right,
instead of buying their medicine or food or whatever. But your response to that, Melvin?
You want me to respond to that?
Well, to her point about money and the church.
Again, I think that we can look at the Bible in two ways. For me, it is a true statement, but not necessarily a statement of truth.
Explain that.
A true statement is someone did say it. Yeah. Someone did write it. But is it a statement of truth, which means that how am I interpreting? Am I interpreting based upon the context and the content of what they intended to say or to do? And so when it comes to money, we have a lot of churches who say that God wants all of us rich. That is not how I interpret it. I think that becomes a way to exploit people for gain. That's my personal perspective. While I know that money is the bargaining tool, it is used in the economy to get certain things done. In church, we have ministries that require the vision is free, but the execution of vision costs. But when you get to the place where it is all about money, and you just store it up, and you buy more luxurious stuff to be seen, and there are still poor people on the corner, there are still people who are in need, there are still uneducated people without tutors, then I think that is an exploitation of our anointing that I think that we will have to pay for one of these days.
Mm-hmm. Eric?
I tell my students that the Bible's not only the good book, it's a great book. And there's an awful lot in there that can go in any way people want to read it. Yeah. All the Western, certainly the monotheistic traditions, have some attitude about money, good and bad. Everybody's got to pay the bills. Clergy eat. So, that's the world we live in. In Judaism, there's this notion that money has no odor, meaning it's not money that's bad, it's what you do with it that's bad. And so you can do good things or you can do bad things. Historically, that's what permitted Jews to lend money at a non-usurious rate. If I work for you, you pay me. If I lend you money, you pay me for that. You don't just give it back. And that led to a great deal of persecution from Christians and from Muslims as well, who had their own notions of money. But the maybe I'm getting the theology wrong. The preferential option for the poor of liberation theology from South America and since is really about addressing the weaknesses of an economic system. I think all religions want to do good, but they all need to do well. and particularly since the 1970s, they're all in competition with each other because people feel, we have a woman calling in who identifies herself as an atheist. 100 years ago, 50 years ago, she would never have done that because it would have been totally unacceptable to identify publicly as an atheist. Thomas Jefferson was attacked by John Adams for being an atheist when they ran against each other. We have a world where religion is one of the things, institutional forms of religion are one of the things people are competing with for membership. You can't count on people staying in the religion in the congregation they grew up in. And so they need to advertise. They need to offer services that are not, whether it's a support group or AA or whatever. And that costs money.
We've got 1:30, so each of you gets 30 seconds to give a final thought about race and religion. I'll start with you, Father Curran.
My thought would be that the whole idea of white privilege is one of white responsibility. That because there is the privilege, there is also the responsibility. Not the blame. I did not create the system. I did not create this, but my faith drives me into a responsibility to change the system.
Okay, that is Father Jim Curran of the Basilica of Saint Mary of the Immaculate Conception Church. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Marriner?
I think that race and religion and segregation is important because we have to look at it in the sense that if we're segregated, which is not bad, I think segregation was perhaps a downfall when it came to black and education. But segregation has to be looked at from the perspective of let's empower you, let's liberate you so you can be an asset to your neighbor down the street, to a different person. It's not about over under. It's about let's make sure that we're assets to the next person.
Dr. Melvin Marriner, who is senior pastor of Grove Church. And Eric, you got the final 30 seconds.
That's a lot of pressure. I'm going back to something my fellow panelists said. One of them said toward the beginning, and that is this notion of religion as behavior. In Judaism, we use the word halakha to talk about Jewish law. That comes from the same root as to walk. In Islam, they talk about the middle path. In Buddhism, there's the great vehicle. It's all about the journey. And if race viewed historically can change, then maybe we just need to change the way we walk in terms of race.
Dr. Eric Mazur with Virginia Wesleyan College, professor of religious studies. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you,
in the spirit of our conversation today, let me quickly tell you about some events happening in our area this weekend. In Williamsburg, leaders of the civil rights movement joined the historic First Baptist Church for a weekend of remembrances, honoring Dr. Martin Luther King and commemorating the 48th anniversary of his death. There are several activities beginning tomorrow and ending Monday, April the 4th, including the ringing of the Freedom Bell. If you recall, First Baptist Church Williamsburg is believed to be the first Black Baptist church in the country organized entirely by African Americans. For a complete schedule, please call 757-585-2146. And please come out and join us for our last town hall discussion in our Race Let's Talk About It initiative. We will continue our discussion of race, religion, relationships, and hopes for redemption. The town hall is at the Fort Monroe Theater on the campus of Fort Monroe, 42 Tidball Road. Doors open at 6 p.m. and our conversation will start promptly at 6:30. This is on Tuesday, April the 5th. Bring your family and friends and members of your house of worship, and I look forward to seeing you there. And finally, some terrific news, a huge shout out and congratulations to our very own Jay Sennett here at WHRV-FM. His latest album, 0 to 60, is now #1 on the National Jazz Week charts. You got a chance to hear some of the music from the album right here on Another View a few weeks ago. Jay, we are so very proud of you. We're so lucky to have Jay as our composer and performer of our theme music. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Kamaria Mason answered our phones. By the way, starting tonight on Channel 15, we present Ken Burns Jazz, starting tonight at 9 on Channel 15. We'll see you next Friday for Another View.